Hello, lovelies, and welcome back to Seriously Now. I'm Lex Carline, and I hope you're having a wonderful week so far. So, we're into the second week of the summer holidays now. How's everybody doing? Anybody thinking about how prison doesn't sound too bad? No, I'm just kidding. Well, we had a minor fender bender this week. Thankfully, everybody's okay, except for the car. Just a little dent that, well, my insurance would write the car off, but the guys at the garage have said they can fix it. Woohoo! Wouldn't it be nice if some of the tourists that came during the busy season could learn to drive a bit better? But hey ho, never mind. Cars can be replaced, people can't. So today we're going to go over to Australia, and wouldn't it be nice to really be there? And we're going to talk about the first woman in their history to be sentenced to life in prison without parole. And her name is Katherine Knight. Now I'm going to issue a trigger warning, which always feels a bit weird with true crime, but you know, this has sexual abuse, violence, mutilation, and more. So if that's not your thing, maybe give this one a miss, and we will see you back next week. So, let's dive in, shall we? If you're still here. Katherine Mary Knight was born on October the 24th, 1955 in Tenterfield, Australia. Her mother Barbara was originally married to a man named John Ruffin, or Jack, with whom she had 4 boys. And it was actually through her husband that Barbara met Ken Knight, with whom she had an affair. Naughty, naughty. Now, Knight and her elder twin sister Joy were the result of this affair, and both the Knight and Ruffin families were well known in the town of Aberdeen, New South Wales, so naturally this scandal rocked the community. Gotta love a bit of scandal. I bet everybody was curtain twitching and because people love a bit of gossip, don't they? Now, due to the affair, Barbara and Ken were forced to move to the town of Moree. Now, the elder of the 2 boys that she shared with Jack remained with him, and the younger 2 were actually sent to live with an aunt of theirs in Sydney. None of them went with their mother. Unfortunately, Jack would die in 1959, and so the elder boys then ended up moving into the Knight household as well. Ken and Barbara would have a total of 4 children, so that made Knight one of 8. So just a small family. Knight's maternal great-grandmother was said to have been an Indigenous woman from the Moree area who married an Irishman. And so Knight's mother Barbara liked to think of the family as Aboriginal, but apparently it was kept a family secret due to high levels of racism in the area, and it was a cause of tension for the kids. There goes my stomach, right on cue. Sorry, guys. So Knight had a chaotic childhood, and was only said to be close to her twin sister and her uncle, Oscar Knight, and he was a champion horseman, so some of you may have heard his name before. Knight was utterly devastated when he committed suicide in 1969, and to this day she maintains that his ghost visits her. Now, the family would move back to Aberdeen the same year as Oscar's death, and unfortunately Knight's father was an abusive alcoholic, not just violent in terms of fisticuffs. He would also rape her mother daily, with reports of up to 10 times a day. A day. Ugh. With her mother, such a lovely sounding mother, sharing the sordid details of these encounters with her children, even telling them how much she hated sex and how much she hated men. Knight would even later tell her mother about certain sex acts that partners of hers wanted her to perform that she really wasn't comfortable with, and instead of being the supportive mother, Barbara simply said, "Put up with it and stop complaining." Stellar advice there, Mum. Now, knowing what she turned into... Gosh, shut up, stomach. Knowing what she turned into, some people would say, oh well. But those of us, I think, who have compassion and a heart and brains would understand this next bit and how absolutely no person, child, adult deserves it. Knight would say that she was abused by several family members until she was 11 years old. Thankfully, I suppose, her father was not one of the abusers. Now, psychiatrists would have minor doubts in the details that she gave, but her claims were actually accepted after family members came forward and confirmed the abuse. I mean, if she hadn't gone through that as a child, who knows? Who knows? But by all accounts, as a child, she was quite a pleasant girl. but she had these uncontrollable rages in response to minor upsets, so they'd be completely disproportionate to what her grievance was. Or deemed as disproportionate, because we're not in the brain, are we? So we don't know exactly what's going through it. So mental health, which is still a big issue today, there's still not enough support, but if it had been better back then, who knows? Again, who knows? But speculatively, I think it's safe to say in this case, if some mental health support had been provided for this poor girl, things may very well not have turned out the way that they did. Anyway, moving on. When she was at Musselbrook High, her classmates remember her as a bit of a loner and a bully, often picking on the kids that were smaller than her, which is often the case with bullies, isn't it? They don't tend to pick on the kids bigger than them. And she assaulted at least one boy with a weapon and was even injured by a teacher. But it's not quite as it sounds. She was actually attacking the teacher, and they hurt her in self-defense. But when she wasn't in one of her rages, she was actually a model student, and she even won awards for good behaviour. So it's very Jekyll and Hyde, isn't it? Which later on she would be diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, which explains some of this. Now, despite sometimes winning awards for her stellar behaviour, Knight would actually leave school at the age of 15, unable to read or write properly. And she got her first job then as a cutter in a clothing factory, which wasn't ideal, but brought some money in for her. And just a year later, at the tender age of 16, Catherine Knight would get what she described as her dream job. Can you guess what it is? Well, if you had working in a slaughterhouse, cutting out the internal organs of dead animals, you can have a point. Each to their own on the dream job front. Not my idea of a dream job, thanks. Again, people would say a sign of things to come, just like murderers and messing with animals when they're kids, but people can dream of working in an establishment like this without any murderous tendencies, you know. It's not that closely linked. Now, in fact, Knight loved her job so very much that she actually hung her first set of knives over her bed, a practice that she would keep wherever she lived, you know, just in case she needed them, which eventually she would. In 1973, Knight met David Kellett through work. He, like her father, was a violent alcoholic, prone to fistfights. Obviously, Knight was used to this, and she actually had her own reputation in Aberdeen for offering to fight anyone who upset her. Now, she surprised Kellett one night by joining in one of his fights, and soon he realised that she was more than capable of serious damage with her hands. Hands can be lethal weapons. Soon, Knight was dominating Kellett, and in 1974, she actually convinced him to marry her. They arrived at the ceremony on her motorbike, with him already steaming drunk. Now, Kellett said that even Knight's mother tried to warn him against her daughter, saying, and this is a direct quote from Kellett, "The old girl said to me to watch out. You better watch this one or she'll fucking kill you. Stir her up the wrong way or do the wrong thing and you're fucked. Don't ever think of playing up on her, she'll fucking kill you." And that was her mother talking. She told me she's got something loose. She's got a screw loose somewhere. Yet he still married her. And it almost ended extremely badly on his wedding night. So, what happened? Well, Knight tried to strangle him after he fell asleep. And bearing in mind he'd been drunk all day, they'd still managed to have sex 3 times. And the horny girl just wanted a 4th go. I mean, the fact that he managed 3 goes, steaming drunk, and he'd obviously been drinking more throughout the day, that in itself is quite impressive. A lot of people don't even make it to 1 on their wedding night. Or so I've been told. But luckily for Kellett, he managed to wake up and fend her off. And so you'd think that was the end of the relationship, wouldn't you? No. Despite this, they would actually go on to stay married for over a decade. Yes, over a decade. But as you can imagine, it wasn't all wedded bliss, and Kellett was often unfaithful, and the relationship was very, very violent. And Knight once burnt all of his clothes after he was late home. He wasn't up to no good. He'd merely reached the final in his game of darts. There was a time where Knight hit Kellett across the back of the head with a frying pan, badly fracturing his skull. Luckily, he managed to escape to a neighbour's where he then collapsed. The police wanted to press charges, but as she, Knight, had been on her best behaviour recently, she'd managed to convince Kellett to drop the charges. Now, surely, maybe it wasn't the case back then, maybe Australian law is different, maybe, surely the police could prosecute on his behalf if they saw fit. She fractured his skull with a frying pan. Come on. In May 1976, shortly after the birth of the couple's first child, Melissa Ann, Kellett finally left Knight for another woman in Queensland. It took him over a decade, and they brought a child in. Can't say much because I've been stuck in toxic relationships where everybody's like, why don't you just leave? And we know it doesn't work like that. But obviously, Kellett's departure, Knight didn't take it so well. She was seen violently thrashing the pram around on the main street with her baby in it. And as such, she was admitted to St Elmo's Hospital in Tamworth, where she would be diagnosed with postnatal depression, which is a really serious thing that people don't talk about enough. Shortly after Knight was released from the hospital, she placed her 2-month-old daughter on the train tracks and just left her there. Then she went and stole an axe and threatened local people. Ted Abraham, or Old Ted as he was known locally, who'd been out foraging in the woods, found the child and luckily obviously picked her up and removed her, with the train said to be just minutes away. Knight was then arrested again and taken back to St Elmo's. She signed herself out the next day, apparently recovered. Make it make sense. She left her baby on the train tracks, went and attacked people with an axe, and was allowed to sign herself out the next day. Okay. And just days after that, she would slash a woman's face and demand that the woman drive her to Queensland to go and find Kellett. Luckily, the woman managed to escape at a service station, but by the time police arrived, Knight had taken a little boy hostage, threatening him with a knife. Woman should have been just locked up then. The police did manage to disarm her by attacking her with brooms, which is quite an image. Knight was then admitted to Morisset Psychiatric Hospital, where she told nurses she was going to kill the mechanic who'd repaired Kellett's car, because that had enabled him to escape, and then she was going to kill her husband and his mother once she got to Queensland. So police would inform Kellett what had happened, and he then left his girlfriend so that he and his mother could move back to Aberdeen to support Catherine Knight. And on the 9th of August 1976, she was released into their care. They moved to Woodbridge, which is a suburb of Brisbane, and Knight started working at Dinmore Meatworks in nearby Ipswich. The couple's second daughter, Natasha Marie, would be born on the 6th of March 1980, and in 1984, Knight actually left Kellett, shocker, and moved back to Aberdeen and back in with her parents, of all people. She returned to working at the abattoir and then rented a house in Muswellbrook, which was close to work. But the following year, she would injure her back at work and then had to go on a disability pension. She gave up her rented house because she didn't need to live near work anymore and moved into a housing commission property in Aberdeen. So in 1986, Knight would meet 38-year-old miner David Saunders. Yep, another David. And just a few months later, he moved in with her. Although he was kind of smart and he actually kept his apartment in Scone, which would make Knight extremely jealous when he wasn't with her because she wondered what he was up to and suspected it was no good. Paranoid much? Now, there would be a pattern of her throwing him out, him moving back to his apartment, and then her going and begging him to come back again, and round they go. And then in May 1987, just to show Saunders what she would do to him if he did have an affair, Knight would slit the throat of his 2-month-old dingo puppy, and then she knocked him out with a frying pan. So in June of 1988, Knight's third daughter Sarah was born. When the child came along, Saunders put a deposit on a house, which Knight would then pay off when her workers' compensation came through in 1989 from hurting her back. She decorated the house throughout, or as some people say, she just covered it in crap. Now, some of it sounds kind of cool, I'm not going to lie. So there was no free space, walls, ceiling, everything covered. And it was things like animal skulls, rusty animal traps, other skulls, old boots, leather jackets, machetes, rakes, pitchforks, knives. And after a particularly bad argument, Knight would hit Saunders in the face with an iron and then stab him in the stomach with a pair of scissors. Come on. How many chances did they miss to stop this woman? So Saunders would move back to Scone, and when he returned home, he found all of his clothes had been cut up. Yeah, Knight had already got there. So he took long service and went into hiding. And I can't say I blame him. Now, Knight did try to find him, but luckily for Saunders, nobody would admit to knowing where he was. That's some good friends. Several months later, he would return to find that she had told police she was afraid of him, and so they issued her with an apprehended violence order, an AVO, against him. Make that make sense. In 1990, Knight would fall pregnant by 43-year-old John Chillingworth, a former co-worker at the abattoir, and in 1991, her first baby boy, Eric, would be born. Their relationship lasted 3 years, and interestingly, there were no reported violent incidents. So either she was really well behaved for a while, or he just didn't tell anyone. What do you think? Now, their relationship came to an end because Knight finally left him for a man that she'd been having a long-standing affair with, John Charles Thomas Price, a father to 3 girls, and whilst the elder 2 lived with him, the youngest stayed with the mother. Apparently he was an all-round top bloke, liked by everybody that knew him. You know, not a bad word to say other than his relationship with her. Even though Price was very much aware of Knight's violent reputation, he still moved her into his house in 1995. And apparently, apart from violent arguments, his children really liked her. And he made a lot of money working in the mines so that he could keep her living comfortably, and at first, life was said to be a bunch of roses. Not sure I could include violent arguments in with bunch of roses, but each to their own. But as you can imagine, this bunch of roses did not last long. And in 1998, they had a massive blowout because Price refused to marry her. To get him back, Knight videoed things that Price had stolen from work and sent it to his boss. What an arsehole. Now, the items in question were out-of-date medical kits that he'd taken from the company's rubbish tip. So although it was rubbish, and nobody really needed it anyway, it's still stealing, and this resulted in him being fired from his job of 17 years. Naturally, Price kicked Knight out the same day, and she moved back into her own house. And they lived happily ever after. Not. Now, the news of what she had done spread throughout the town, but for some unknown reason, a few months later, Price restarted their relationship. But this time, he refused to let her move back in. So the fighting became even more frequent, because I imagine she kicked off with not being able to get her own way. It's my assumption. And his friends even began refusing to associate with him whilst he stayed in a relationship with her, which I imagine at that point was probably for their own mental health, never mind anything else. In February of 2000, a series of assaults on Price by Knight resulted in her stabbing him in the chest. This resulted in her kicking him out once and for all. Woohoo, we'd say. But oh wait. On the 29th of February, on his way to work, Price stopped at Scone Magistrates Court to take out a restraining order on Catherine Knight, and this was to keep her away from both him and his children. Smart move. Ironically, he told co-workers that if he didn't turn up for work the next day, it was because she had killed him. So, naturally, like any concerned co-worker or friend would do, they begged him not to go home. But he firmly believed that she would kill his children if he didn't, and I can't say I blame him for thinking that. So, you would go home, wouldn't you? Ugh. When he returned home, although Knight wasn't there at that point, he found that she'd arranged for the children to have a sleepover at a friend's, which, if he's already kicked her out once and for all, but yet she's arranging sleep, that's alarm bells for me already. I'm sorry. I'd be like, no, you don't get to arrange stuff for my children anymore. So Price spent the evening with his neighbours before retiring to bed at around about 11 p.m. Earlier that day, Knight had treated herself to some new black lingerie. And weirdly, she'd also videotaped all of her children making comments that have since been interpreted as a crude will. Now, Knight would arrive at Price's house after he had gone to sleep. She watched TV for a little while, and then she had a shower, put on the lingerie, woke Price up where they had sex, and then he fell asleep again. It was after this sexual encounter that Knight would attack Price. In total, she stabbed him 37 times, and wounds were found in both the front and the back of his body, with many extending into his vital organs. Now, blood evidence would reveal that Price awoke during the attack and tried to fend her off. He tried to turn on the light, and then it looked like he was chased through the home. He did manage to make it to the front door and even get outside, so he was so close. Don't know whether he would have survived or not, but he was so close to getting out. But he either stumbled backwards or he was pulled back inside. He was then dragged into the hallway, where he would bleed to death. Shortly after she'd murdered him, Knight went and withdrew $1,000 from Price's account. And as if murdering him wasn't enough, Knight would then skin his body, and she hung it from a meat hook in the living room. She would decapitate him and cut off various pieces to cook in a dish, along with potatoes, pumpkin, beets, zucchini, cabbage, squash and gravy. You know, she was making a human casserole for dinner. 3 dishes in total were found at the crime scene. 1 half-eaten strewn across the back lawn, so maybe she couldn't stomach her vile creation. And the 2 others, brace yourselves, well, they were found on the table with place markers for Price's children. Yes, folks, she was going to feed their dad to them. What the fuck? I mean, the whole case is kind of that, but... Price's head was still on the hob when police arrived, and the temperature revealed that it had been cooked in the early hours of the morning. So after the brutal murder and macabre cooking, you'd think she'd flee, wouldn't you? No. Knight lay down next to Price's mutilated corpse, which she'd arranged with his left arm draped over an empty 1.25-litre soft drink bottle with his legs crossed, took a large amount of pills, and she passed out. Now, in court, this would be claimed to be an act of defilement and is said to have demonstrated her contempt for Price. Knight also left a handwritten note on top of a photo of him, which was blood-stained along with bits of his flesh. Lovely. And I'm going to read this in the way that it's spelt. Time got you back, Johathon, for rapping my doubter. You to Beck, which is Price's daughter. For Ross. For Little John, his son. Now play with Little John's dick, John Price. Yeah. So these accusations, unsurprisingly in my opinion, would be found to be groundless. So she was just trying to make it look like she'd killed him because he'd been fiddling with her daughter. It just gets worse and worse, doesn't it? At 6 a.m. the next morning, Price's neighbour became concerned when they saw that his car was still on the drive. Normally, he'd be at work by then, and when he didn't arrive at work, his boss sent another worker to check on him. So the co-worker and the neighbour tried knocking on Price's bedroom window to wake him up, just in case, he'd overslept or something more innocent. And then they noticed the blood on the front doorstep, so they would call the police, who arrived by 8 a.m. The police would break down the back door, and they would find the mutilated remains of John Price, along with the passed-out Catherine Knight. Now, Knight was immediately detained, and when she awoke, surprise, surprise, she claimed to have no knowledge of the night before. That old chestnut, how many people use that one, or try and use that one? Now, despite this, Knight was quickly charged with murder. She initially offered a manslaughter plea, which was rejected, and she was arraigned in February 2001 for murder, where she entered a not guilty plea. I mean, you're found sleeping, cuddled up to the corpse, with his head on the hob. Now, the trial was initially set to start on July the 23rd, 2001, but it had to be adjourned because her counsel fell ill, so it was reset for the 15th of October that same year. Justice Barry O'Keefe would give the 60 jury prospects the option of being excused due to the extremely graphic nature of the photographic evidence. Imagine that was, those would be some images, wouldn't they? Now, 5 would accept this offer, and then several more dropped out after the list of witnesses was read out. The jury was then impaneled, which means they were chosen and seated. But after Knight's legal team spoke to the judge, court was then adjourned until the next day, when Knight would suddenly offer a guilty plea. And it seems the justice was aware of this pending change, because as well as adjourning the case, he ordered an overnight psychiatric assessment to ensure that Knight understood the consequences of her new plea and whether or not she was fit to make such a decision. Her legal team had planned to use amnesia and disassociation in her defence, which was supported by most of the psychiatrists that assessed her, although they found her to be sane. After the guilty plea was entered, which no reason was given as to the change of plea, why she suddenly decided to go with that, the judge quickly adjourned without testimonies and Knight was taken immediately to jail. Now, at the sentencing hearing, Knight's team requested that she be exempt from hearing the more depraved facts of her case. This was refused. Good, she'd been declared sane, there was no reason medically why she couldn't hear all the details, so yes, damn right, she needs to hear them all. And when Dr. Timothy Lyons took the stand and discussed the decapitation and mutilation, Knight became hysterical and had to be sedated. The reality of her crimes sinking in, maybe? Accountability is hard, but it's something we all need to be better at. Accountability is sexy. Well, maybe not in this case, there's nothing sexy about this case, but hopefully you get what I mean. On the 8th of November 2001, Justice O'Keefe stated that with the nature of the crimes and the lack of remorse from Knight, it required a severe penalty. Her papers would be marked never to be released, and she would be the first woman in Australian history to receive a full life tariff without the possibility of parole. In June 2006, Knight actually tried appealing her sentence, which is often par for the course in these sorts of cases, and she said that no possibility of parole was too harsh a sentence for the killing. What? He killed, decapitated, cooked? No! I think you're exactly where you should be. Now, Justices Peter McClellan, Michael Adams and Megan Latham dismissed this in the New South Wales Court of Appeal in September, stating in McClellan's judgment, this was an appalling crime, almost beyond contemplation in a civilised society. So yeah, you stay in put, love, sorry. And to this day, Katherine Knight continues to plead her innocence and refuses to take any responsibility for her actions. She is currently serving her sentence in Silverwater Women's Correctional Centre, and that, my lovelies, is the tumultuous tale of Katherine Knight. It's a bit of a wild one, isn't it? I mean, we know that people can do all sorts of depraved and basically fucked up things, but this one's a special one. So if you made it to the end, as always, thank you so much for sticking it out with me. I appreciate you all, and I wouldn't be here without you. I would be eternally grateful if you guys could like and share this, and so we can spread the word further and grow this Seriously Now family. Next week, we are going to be looking at some haunted hotels, specifically in America. So, as always, you can find me on the socials at Seriously Now Pod. And if you are willing or able to donate to the channel, our email address is seriously-now-pod@gmail.com, and it's the same email for you to send in your content requests, your feedback, anything really, even if you just want to say hi. So until next time, lovelies, stay safe, stay free, and stay weird. Bye-bye.